let's talk about Diary of a CEO.
Podcasting Insights.
I want to talk about it because Diary of a CEO and the whole genre of glossy, Titan interviewing, formula peddling mega podcast it represents is doing something genuinely damaging to indie podcasters. Right out in the open. No attempt to hide it whatsoever. Possibly even to you. And the really interesting part here, the part that should probably keep you awake at night, or at least mildly inconvenience your afternoon, is that it doesn't need to be malicious to be harmful. The damage isn't by accident, it's actually the business model. Let me explain.
Podcasting Insights.
I've said it before and I'll keep saying it until people actually start to listen. People like Stephen Bartlett, Hala Taha, and Alex Hormozi are goons. They're not evil goons. They're probably not even stupid goons. They're perceived to be successful goons who have figured out that the most profitable thing you can sell someone isn't a solution. It's that feeling that a solution is just around the corner from you. But don't take my word for it. Let me give you some actual research. Because Neal thinks they're goons doesn't quite cut it as an intellectual foundation. Even I'm aware of that. Let me tell you about Phil Rosenzweig. Phil is a business school professor who spent years studying something very specific. And that was how we decide why successful companies succeeded. What he found and then documented in a book called The Halo Effect is almost offensively straightforward once you've heard it. When a company's doing well, we look at its leadership and we call it visionary. You know, the culture, the dynamic, the strategy, all bold. But then the same company hits the skids. Same leadership, but now suddenly described as arrogant. Same culture, now siloed and resistant to change. Same strategy is now reckless. And I could name particularly wet brand that this could definitely apply to. I wonder what brand leader I might be referring to. Showbiz Wink. See, nothing's actually changed there, it's just the outcome is different. And we worked backwards from that outcome and constructed a story that made it feel inevitable. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because that's the entire editorial model of Diary of a CEO. Guest comes in, sits down. Guest was successful. That is the rule. Guest explains why. Brain then assembles a coherent narrative from what was actually a chaotic, contingent, luck-riddled mess. We all nod along and take notes. Stephen Bartlett then charges advertisers a fortune to podcast the whole thing to an alleged millions of people. I say alleged because the data I've seen suggests it's still only in the hundreds of thousands range. Anyway, that's a debate for another episode. I think I may have even already published that one, by the way, a couple of years ago, if you want to peruse the library of past episodes. Back on to the point. Let's talk about Nassim Taleb's Fooled by Randomness. Now, if you haven't read it, it has a concept he calls the silent graveyard. And I think about this basically every time I see another success porn podcast dropping into the business chart or being praised in my LinkedIn feed by some wannabe influencer bruh. Here's the idea. You look out at the world and you see winners. Founders who built things. Podcasters who grew audiences. People who posted their frameworks and their 10-step systems and their morning routines and made it all the way to the point where they get to explain their morning routine on someone else's podcast. Yay! What you don't see as part of that whole parading of success is the graveyard. The equally talented, equally hardworking, equally routine-having ass people who tried the same things, moved the same levers, and failed anyway. They're getting up at 5 a.m., but they're not seeing stars. They're not on podcasts. They're not being booked on keynote stages. They're not selling you their 33 laws of attraction. They're just gone. And the graveyard is silent, hence the name. So when Diary of a CEO books another guest to explain exactly how they got to where they are, you're not getting a representative sample of what those strategies actually produce. You're getting a cherry-picked survivor insisting the cherry-picking didn't even happen. And it gets better, or worse, depending on your disposition around this whole thing. In 2006, researchers Matthew Selganick and Duncan Watts at Columbia ran an experiment that should frankly be shown to every podcaster before they're allowed to download a single episode of a success advice show. They built an artificial music market. 14,000 participants, 48 songs, all by unknown bands. Participants could listen and download whatever they liked. Now, one group made their choices with absolutely no information about what anyone else had downloaded. Completely independent judgment. Kind of like the opposite of a Swiftie. The other groups could see the download counts within their group. Now, let me point out that if quality were the main driver of success here, the same songs would rise to the top across every single group, consistently, because they're objectively the best tracks. I mean, quality wins, right? Wrong. Embarrassingly wrong. The same song could be number 1 in one group and number 40 in another. Identical track, completely the same. The only difference was who happened to download it first. Early momentum created its own pull, and this translates to business. The rich get richer not because they're better, but because they got a random early advantage, and everyone else follows. So the next time you're trying to reverse engineer why a podcast got big, whether it's their interview technique, their niche, their consistency, their launch strategy, just remember, you might be studying the podcast equivalent of which show someone clicked on first on a random Tuesday afternoon. Luck, timing, chance. Yes, quality's in the formula, but so is chance. Now here's the part of this that gets really fun. Even the people giving you that misleading information probably aren't lying, not consciously anyway. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel laureate. Look up Thinking Fast and Slow, because this identified what he called the narrative fallacy. The human brain cannot tolerate randomness. It needs a because. It needs a story. It needs the chaos to have been planned all along. So a founder navigates several near-death experiences, catches a lucky break at exactly the right moment, and builds something remarkable. Then they sit down on a podcast and they explain it. And they will explain it fully, confidently, with the 3 things they always come back to and the mindset shift that changed everything. Their brain has spent the intervening years constructing a story that makes the whole messy, random, timing-dependent journey feel deliberate and teachable. And at this point, they genuinely probably believe it. They're not lying, they're just human. The problem is that you're on the other end of a story that feels like a strategy, but is actually a retrospective hallucination. And you're furiously taking notes and planning change around this furiously acquired notage. Basically, your brain is doing the thing that you moan at AI for doing, needing to get to an outcome, having no idea, but going by very comfortable and predictable text solutions to fill the gaps. And while we're on the subject of honesty, and I'm only going to say this once before moving on to a much more interesting ground, let's talk about the UK advertising watchdog, who has had to ban Stephen Bartlett's content more than once for neglecting to mention he had commercial stakes in the products he was warmly endorsing on his own show. The show supposedly built on no-filter authenticity and straight talk. The irony there is so structurally dense, I'm genuinely surprised his studio ceiling hasn't caved in on him and ruined the perfectly manufactured, temperatured air that he pumps in the faces of the many gurus he parades on his clickbait-infected disease of a show. But look, let's not just pick on Bartlett. There's also High Performance Podcast, Jake Humphrey and Damian Hughes earnestly extracting peak performance insights from people who were already going to peak regardless. Like interviewing a lottery winner about their number-picking strategy. And there's Young and Profiting, where Hala Taha has built an engagement pod leveraging networking empire, dressed up as a podcast, and then made that the advice. Be more like me. Use engagement pods. Network more. Have me on your show. It is a beautiful closed loop if you can stomach it, which I struggle with. All of them are in the business of monetizing that gap between what they promise and what they can actually deliver. And that gap has to remain. If it ever closed, you'd have exactly what you needed, you'd never need them, and you'd leave. And they can't have that. So let's talk about what this is actually doing to you as an indie podcaster. And I want you to sit with this for a moment, rather than just nodding, shrugging your shoulders, and then moving on. Because that's the easy next step. When you consume enough of this content, you start measuring your show against a benchmark that was built mostly by luck, timing, money, and in many cases, connections that existed before that microphone was ever even switched on. Your show doesn't meet that benchmark. Unless you are independently wealthy and are doing your show as a hobby, fair enough, great, you might well have that benchmark. But most people are not in that situation. Most things don't meet that benchmark, let alone podcasts. I mean, nothing real does. That's what makes it such a durable benchmark. So you kind of feel like you're failing. That anxiety creeps in. And this is the genius move, dark as it is. The very content making you feel like a failure is also sort of selling you the solution. A course, framework, a book. Use code DIARY20. Use code YAP15. There's always a code. There's always another purchase. You never quite crack it, but you also never quite stop trying to. That's not a side effect, that is the literal product. A podcast that genuinely fixed your problems would be 10 episodes long. You'd finish it, you'd feel sorted, you'd go and make your own show, and you'd never come back. And nobody is building a business around that. The business is built around you staying anxious, staying subscribed, staying one framework away. I'm trying to avoid that with this show, but there is a psychological inevitability around me being unable to avoid that. Obviously, it's in my interest that you continue to keep listening to get more insight so you can get more success. But I have no control over that because, as I've already explained, there's a big element of chance. All I can do is give you the insights that I know to help you make your own luck. So what do you do instead? I guess the point of this is I want you to stop benchmarking yourself against shows that live in a completely different economic universe. Diary of a CEO is not a podcast in the way that your show is a podcast. Kind of like a super yacht is technically a boat. It floats on water. That doesn't mean studying it will help you get more from your kayak, which also floats on water. Get suspicious of certainty. I've said it before. The podcasting advice space is swimming in people with systems and steps and formulas delivered in a tone that suggests nuance has never once troubled them. Real expertise tends to produce humility, not frameworks. Just ask Rosenzweig. Ask Taleb. Look at the music lab data. The advisor who says, it depends on your specific show and your specific audience, they're almost certainly more useful to you than the one who says, do these 5 things and enjoy success immediately. One of those is great content. The other one is actually helpful. And they're rarely the same thing. And stop mistaking a survivor's story for a strategy. Make the show that you can make. Make it useful, make it interesting, make it consistent. Accept that above a quality flaw, a meaningful chunk of what happens next is completely outside your control. And that is true for everyone, including the people on the podcasts, swearing blind that it isn't. There's a famous saying, and I can't remember who it's by, but I do love to quote it when this sort of topic comes up. The planes that didn't make it back didn't get to tell you where the bullets hit them. Keep that in mind every time someone tells you they've cracked the code.
Okay, enough plane crashing nonsense. Quick one for you. Let me tell you about Huel.